I don't remember the first time that I was harassed on the street, but I remember the first time I was like, yeah, I definitely did not deserve that. You all are having the experience of going to college in Southern California, but I went to college in South Central Michigan, where it's about 100 degrees colder than this all the time. One time, I sort of realized I'd done the wrong thing when I didn't dry my hair fully, and between the walk from my dorm to class, it froze in these like weird chunks. So I'm just saying, modesty is a different conversation in Michigan. You have to sort of learn to bundle up. I'm talking wool socks and boots and leggings and then jeans over the leggings and sweaters and big puffy coats and mittens and scarves and hats. And I was wearing all of that plus my backpack when I was walking up to class. And I mean sort of like shuffling, hobbling because it was icy and I was trying not to fall over. And somebody yell, "Hey!" And I turn and look, and this guy has rolled down the window of his car, and he goes, "Woo! Yeah, girl, looking good." And my first thought was, wow, I'm kind of impressed that he could even tell I was a girl wearing all of this. And then I felt the waves of shame and embarrassment and powerlessness because I was wearing more clothes than anyone possibly could be, and I still got yelled at by some stranger who wanted to take his opinion of my body and gender and yell them to me out of a car window. And that's probably one of the moments when I realized that everything I learned about modesty growing up didn't exactly work in the real world. Following modesty rules didn't get me the good results I was promised. It didn't protect me from being yelled at on the street. It didn't magically make all my relationships great. In many ways, it did the opposite. I'm a rule follower by nature. I grew up in evangelical culture and always went to church, and I was happily a good girl. I won Bible quizzing trophies, and I was a good student, and I didn't kiss a boy until I was 21. I don't say that to brag, but the Bible quizzing trophies were like really big in the 90s, so kind of bragging. Actually, I'm just trying to assure you that I never showed up with an agenda. I'm not here out of bitterness or anger. I'm here to talk about my story and how the messages that I got growing up in the evangelical world affected me and my life. And I hope you're doing a lot of that too these days. I know it's finals. You can't really think about anything except getting out of here. But I hope that the reason why you went to a Christian college is because you wanted to be challenged and shaped and supported in your life and faith. And I hope that now is the time in your life when you're starting to look back and think about the things that you heard and the things that you've experienced and kind of process those and figure out what you want to keep with you in your life. I don't expect that you take all my ideas or agree with them tonight, but I do hope that telling my story about my shift in thinking about modesty can open up some new pathways for your discussions here on campus. I titled my talk, "Are Leggings Pants and Other Questions of Biblical Modesty?" because I think the question, are leggings pants, is such a ridiculous example of how off track we can get when we're talking about modesty. We focus in on these details and expound on the reasons why bikinis or yoga pants or Speedos are technically legal for Christians to wear, but you probably shouldn't wear them if you're a really good Christian and you actually care about other people's souls. And then we wrap that all up, and we share it in blogs across Facebook, and we take it in. But despite our good intentions, often the way that evangelical culture emphasizes modesty isn't really helping. I think that instead of thinking of the Bible as a dress code for holiness for the 21st century, the Bible offers us something really different and a lot more complicated. Instead of answering our silly questions, the Bible gives us examples of people who are living faithfully in the culture that they were in and seeking God's input into the way they interacted with others. The Bible is not a useful dress code unless you are a priest in ancient Israel. Then it's pretty specific. But there are no questions like, are bare skins actually tunics? Or how much shoulder can a man's robe show before he's responsible for someone else's sin? I think the Bible is absolutely the wrong place to look for the answers to the question, are leggings pants? But it is the right place to look for truth about who we are and how much we matter to God and how to bring justice to a world that is full of systems of injustice and hierarchy. And I think modesty is actually one of those systems. It sets some people's bodies up as better than others. And to me, that's a complete destruction of who God says we are. So a little bit more about my story. As a woman who grew up in evangelical culture, modesty rules were always part of my social vocabulary and my faith experience. I learned more about modesty than I think I did about puberty in middle school. There was a modesty talk at the camps that I went to, modesty pledges at conferences I attended. It was a discussion that came up in Bible studies, at ladies' teas, in youth group, and in conversations with my Christian friends, and all of my friends were Christians. We all wanted to find out how to do this well. We took it really seriously. It seemed really important. And though the trappings varied a little bit, the lectures and conversations were always the same. People in charge talked about what girls these days were wearing and what they should wear, and how the act of putting on clothes in the morning could radically change what boys were thinking. Women, they said, were naturally clueless about what they were wearing, and men were different because they were visual, whatever that meant. But we could serve our brothers, not out of obligation, but because we cared about them so much by dressing with them in mind. People talked about how modesty was a sacrifice we made for the good of men in church, how subscribing to their modesty standard was a protection from the leers and lusts of strange and dangerous men in the world, and a lot about how covering the female body would prove to everyone that we respected ourselves as Christian women and that they would naturally respect us. In addition to the reasons why I should be modest, I learned over the years that there were endless options for violations in modesty land, depending on the exact situation and circumstances and body shape that you had. I began to notice that the rules I tried to follow were always a little bit different, depending on what camp or youth group or activity I was at and who was in charge that year. I'd get stuck in this back and forth of what exactly is modest dressing? How do I do that? And when I tried to pin someone down, I'd get a lecture on how actually modesty is really a heart issue. However, it seemed odd that the only way that I could prove that my heart was pure was by dressing to specific, detailed rules that were always changing and no one could agree on. One camp I went to allowed tank tops as long as the straps were 3 fingers wide. But the next year, they decided that actually that was totally inappropriate to wear 3-finger-wide straps, and sleeveless tops were just not allowed at all. Modesty rules had an enormous social and spiritual power over my upbringing, but they were never consistent. And after time, what I absorbed was this idea that I wasn't a person with a body that was mine to dress. I was an outfit with the power and responsibility to control the morality of every man I encountered. And I took that responsibility really seriously. I've seen the destruction of the modesty rules play out in my life in many different ways. Because of the constant pressure of those modesty rules, my relationship with my body was disjointed at best. My friendships with other women have been marked by jealousy and judgment, and interactions with men were filled with fear. I genuinely wanted to obey God. I wanted to honor God and be close to God, but over time, I started to believe that my body made that impossible. I remember one instance when that was made really clear to me. I was about 15, and I was wearing a teal shirt that I'd purchased with my own money I made babysitting, and I was at an event where modesty rules were strictly enforced. I loved that shirt, and I showed up wearing a tank top underneath so I could successfully raise my hands in worship without showing midriff, and my jeans weren't even that tight. I was following all the rules. I didn't even think about it. But then I was stopped by a leader that I really liked. I remember how my heart sank, and I actually leaned back against the wall to prepare myself for what I was going to experience. I'd seen the way others girls had looked when it had happened to them. Emily, she said, you can't wear that shirt because it emphasizes your figure. A smaller girl could wear it and be fine, but you can't. I still remember how awful that felt. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to be so small that I vanished and never existed. Here I showed up at this event wanting to worship God and hang out with my friends, and I was suddenly the problem. And I don't hate that well-meaning person who said those intended to be caring and protective words. And I don't hate other women who are differently bodied than me and somehow, because of that, spiritually authorized to wear the clothes that were forbidden to me. And I didn't hate that shirt, which I was so proud of, that covered me from collarbone to hip bone. I internalized all of it, and I hated myself. I hated my figure, my shape, my size, my skin. I hated existing. Growing up, I hated my chest, the things I couldn't do, the limitations, the stares, the lectures, the looks from moms and female peers alike, and the knowing that boys might be looking too, and it would be my fault if they noticed that I was a girl and I had boobs and they couldn't avoid lusting after me. I hated because I couldn't do a single thing about the danger of specific parts of my body, even though I was trying so hard. I'd been marked as one of the girls who was showing off her figure, and that was one of the worst sins a girl could commit in the church that I grew up in. I was so ashamed. I didn't ask to be shaped a certain way, nor could I control the way my body looked. And I felt a little bit ashamed because when I was being honest, I knew that it wasn't just the guys who were visual. I was visual too, whatever that meant. Modesty rules told me that wise women spent their energy protecting the sexuality of their brothers in Christ. And when I got that message and girls were left out of that, it told me that there was something wrong with me as a woman to have strong sexual desires. It meant that I assumed that I was alone in that. As a girl struggling with the male problem of sexuality, I was isolated and for so many years was stuck in a cycle of shame and overpowered by it, instead of being able to ask for help in stewarding my sexuality well. Modesty culture too often focuses on the sexual desires of men, the wants and affections of men, and often that means that there is no space for women to be honest and prayerful and open about their own sexual struggles. Over the past 3 years of talking about modesty online and processing my experience and learning from so many other women, I've heard a lot of stories about people who experienced the same thing. Other women felt disconnected from their bodies after growing up under modesty culture, or hated certain parts of themselves, or experienced disordered eating diseases, or blamed themselves for the abuse that was acted upon them. They've dealt with sexual struggles alone because they thought they were the only women watching porn. And women, if any of this hits home for you, I want you to know that you are not alone. There is hope for healing for your relationships with your body and your sexuality and your community. And I hope that you stay and ask for help tonight, or find me on Twitter, or look up my blog and know that you're not alone in any of this. Modesty rules also damaged my ability to have relationships with guys. Growing up, modesty rules filled my brain and spirit, and even though they were intended to protect me, they damaged my ability to have healthy relationships with men. Modesty culture thrives on a fear of male sexuality and power, and sets up men and women as enemies in the struggle for purity. The way we often talk about modesty, we tell a story of binaries, of all men being one way and all women being another way, and everyone is sort of attracted to the same things, so as long as you stay in your box, everything will be fine. We talk about how women need to cover X so that men don't Y. But attraction is not the same for everyone. When modesty culture perpetuates an idea that men are visual or men can't help themselves and therefore women have to do whatever they want, and that women's bodies are ultimately responsible for any violent frenzy or taking or abuse or harassment that they receive because they could have just dressed differently, we are damaging the souls of men and women. We end up blaming victims of abuse and trauma rather than holding people who choose to violate others accountable. Growing up, I heard the analogy that women need to dress modestly because you wouldn't take an alcoholic to a bar, right? This analogy was very powerful for many people that I've talked to, and I still see it come up all the time when I talk about modesty online. But the problem with that analogy is that women's bodies are not bottles of beer. And men are not alcoholics for women's bodies. By telling men that they are inherently sexual addicts and sinners just because their hormones are working, by telling men that they are sexual aggressors and women are ignorant sexual objects, by telling men that it is the fault of women that they struggle in their sexuality, we hurt men and their ability to make choices for their own lives. We create this unnecessary friction between men and women instead of seeing each other as brothers and sisters and partners in the quest for obedience and purity. I don't have any good examples of friendships with men growing up. This is how modesty rules based on fear worked for me. I could be sarcastic with guys, but I couldn't be friendly, even if I genuinely wanted to be. I was afraid that I'd be unknowingly giving off signals of impurity, or that my body would be seen as desirable and I'd be responsible for someone's sin. It was easier to just stay away from guys or be aggressive and distant. And my life and faith suffered without male friendship growing up. When I talk to my guy friends now, they tell me stories about a similar self-hatred from their side of modesty culture. My friend Micah Murray wrote a blog post called "I Am Not a Sex-Fueled Robot" about how he grew out of his ideas of modesty culture and sexuality, and I really hope you guys would look that up. Men, I want to say to you, you are not monsters. You are not broken, and there is healing for the ways that you view your body and your sexuality and the people around you. You are not alone, and I hope that you stay tonight and talk to someone, or find somebody in your dorm, or be honest with somebody that you know. So let's talk about lust. Let's talk about this big problem that modesty rules are going to help us avoid. Many of the discussions about modesty rules relate clothing directly to lust, but I think that's a mistake. I propose that we have lost sight of what lust actually is. In fact, I think in so many ways in Christian culture, we have confused biological sexual attraction with lust and called it all sin. This is one reason why shame is so rampant in Christian circles, why we hide rather than confess a reality, why we try to control everything with modesty rules rather than offering each other the open love and freedom of Christ. We have made into sin something that is not sin. The blanket statement that sexual attraction is always lust is damaging men and women alike. There is nothing wrong with being sexually or physically attracted to someone, even based on his or her looks. God created us to desire another person for affection and intimacy and relationship. Being physically attracted to someone is not the same thing as lust. Feeling great in your clothes does not cause lust. Wanting to be attractive does not cause lust. Having a body that looks appealing to someone else does not cause them to lust after you. Those desires can be a catalyst for related to lust, but in themselves, sexual desire is morally neutral, God-created, biological, and chemical reactions. Your body recognizing some sexual compatibility with another person is not inherently evil. And don't get me wrong, lust is serious and lust is a sin. But lust is about control of sexuality, not just sexual attraction. Lust is dehumanizing a person in your own heart and mind. It reduces someone to your sexual object or plaything. It is the ritual taking, obsessing, and using someone for your own benefit rather than valuing that person as an equal creation in the image of God. It is that taking and controlling and desiring and manipulating part that's the problem of the equation, not the sexual desire part. And modesty rules are actually full of this same controlling spirit that drives lust. Control in the context of modesty is assuming that what other people are wearing is all about you. Control is taking someone's whole person and putting them into one box that you've created for them based on how they look in what they're wearing. Lust is forming people in your own image for your own purposes, whether for sexual pleasure or emotional security or moral superiority. Lust reduces the complexity of each individual and their story to something that you get to manage. Lust certainly has a sexual component, but when we reduce it merely to the same thing as sexual reactions in our bodies, we miss out on the infinite value of all people. This is why dressing a certain way will never eliminate the sin of lust. Lust is much bigger and deeper than that. The cure for lust is not creating a controlled environment where lust is never or rarely triggered. Only Jesus can lovingly confront and heal a lustful heart through the working of the Holy Spirit. You can't change anyone, and ultimately, you are only responsible for taking your own heart to Jesus. Now, I want to say two things really quick. There's nothing wrong with dress codes. Before you start assuming that I think people should be walking around naked, because people accuse me of that all the time, let me say this. I would absolutely encourage all men and women to dress in a socially acceptable manner and to abide by the community dress codes that you have here at Biola. You agreed to that when you joined this community. You can keep that standard. But you don't keep it because it makes you holier or better than anyone else. Jesus is the only thing that can make you holy. Clothing choices always have been and always will be culturally relative and very personal decisions. They just never determine someone's worth or how you should treat them. And the second thing I want to caution you to is be gentle with each other. If you start telling stories about body and personal history and sexuality, those conversations are going to need to be filled with grace and prayer, and if necessary, a qualified counselor. There are many powerful messages in our culture that tell both men and women that certain shapes and sizes and skin color and abilities and economic status and ethnicities are better than others. Those messages are contrary to God's kingdom. But so often they sit side by side in our church culture, and we can't always tell when they're crossing over. I think modesty does that. It sets a hierarchy of people, saying other people have to make decisions for you based on something that you should be dealing with in your heart. Modesty rules affect people differently, and your story may be very different than mine. But I encourage you that you can't do this alone. You need each other in this community to work that out. What I hope is that we can stop pretending like we have this all figured out and we can keep talking about it beyond the fear. So as you probably have guessed by now, or I'm just not very good at this, my answer to the question, are leggings pants, is yes. But also no, because who cares? If they're pants to you, that's great. I was looking up, I try to give this alternate definition of modesty that's wear what's socially appropriate. And I was trying to figure out if I could use the example of, is it socially appropriate to wear a scuba diving suit to a wedding? And then I started down this rabbit hole of scuba vacation weddings under the ocean. It was really weird. So are leggings pants? It doesn't matter. That is the wrong sort of question to ask the Bible. The right question is, how are we going to live faithfully in a world that is outside of our control, existing in unique bodies with unique sexualities, and surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who are not like us, except in that they are made in the image of God too? How do you live on campus together while not being in control? How do you go home for Christmas break and live in your community there? How do we live outside of the fear that is produced by so much of modesty culture and rhetoric? And I can't answer that question easily for you because there's no easy answer. But I want to ask you to try a few things. Give up your judgment of what other people are wearing. Give up trying to take responsibility for someone else or demand, even nicely, that they alter their choices for you. Learn to tell the difference from when you're sexually attracted to someone and when you want them to be your sexual object. Stop blaming anyone else, even a teeny bit, for your lust, but talk to somebody about it. And when someone confesses to you that they struggle with lust, the correct response is, yeah, me too. Because we cannot celebrate our full equal humanity if a certain group of humans has to fear and hide their bodies in order to be accepted in the church. We cannot be people who stand in a world and say our God is the infinite creator of beauty and light and life, when we as Christians are also the people determined to fit every human in the same small, shame-filled boxes. We cannot become a community of people who learn to love God and love others well when we set up the expectation that one half of our community is inherently a threat to the whole, just because they're there. We cannot mature as individual people with uniquely beautiful bodies and biological attractions and a common hope for God's will when we demand that other people consider our needs before theirs when they get dressed in the morning, and then shame them if we perceive that they didn't do that. So instead of perpetuating the fear-based rules and shame of modesty culture, I encourage you to walk in faith. The action of faith is not to make everyone the same so that we don't have to be afraid to be in the world and we can control what we see and how it makes us feel and what we want to do and what we can get out of it. The action of faith is much riskier and harder. In faith, we confess that we are the bodies that Genesis describes as made out of dust and the very breath of God. There is never any easy way out of that tension. In faith, we admit that sexuality and attraction are complicated, but we trust that God will be with us even when we feel out of control. We also commit to vulnerability and honesty and grace with each other because we know that we are not alone in any of this. In faith, we proclaim that the kingdom of God is better than a world that sets up a hierarchy of privilege for certain looks and skin color and body shapes and sizes and races and abilities. In faith, we seek justice for unique people because we believe that circumstance or whether we would ever wear what she's wearing, people are made in the image of God. In faith, we sing of a love that will not let us go, no matter what we look like or what we wear or how we're feeling, and we try to build communities that reflect that reality. So I'm going to pray for you guys because that's a lot of work to do. And I know you're tired, and I know it's the end of the semester, but I hope there's something that I said tonight that you can think about and talk to someone about and make your own decision about. So would you pray with me? The band is going to come up, and I'm going to say a prayer, and then we'll have a little more worship. God, we come before you as people who are dust and your breath. We come to you as people in a room that's filled with individual hurts and desires and pieces of this story. Help us to talk to each other. Help us to work out our faith and our sexuality and our clothing choices with honesty. Help us to celebrate and learn that our bodies are beautiful and we do not have to fear each other. Help us to see that we are made in your image and made holy by Jesus. Help us to want and act for justice and tear down systems that perpetuate hierarchy, even when it costs us something. Thank you for becoming a body and becoming broken and made whole so that we are made whole too. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.